Hello everyone, today we talk about the Burgundian States military history from the Battle of Rosebeke 1382 to the Wars of Liège 1465-1468. We'll pass through sort of different episodes at a time because these clashes were also part of broader uprisings, series of wars, etc. I naturally made videos already about the Burgundian States, including its military history, mostly from the time of Charles the Bold. In fact, as you understand from the title here, there's going to be a second part until the Battle of Guinegate, if anything, to complete a bit like properly the military history of the Burgundian state, right? That are something very different from, at least in a conceptual sense, from the Duchy of Burgundy, from which they had historically originated, with Valois Burgundy House as a branch of the Capetian house, as well as the earlier Burgundians, that the Kingdom of Burgundy was yet another thing. It's a complex history. On Schwerpunkt, I covered this pretty widely. We still have to talk about Lotharingia, etc., but here we focus specifically on this historiographical denomination, Burgundian States, that stresses its composite nature, how that come to be sort of agglutinated together, a bit like the Papal States, the same terminology and didactic convention for, in fact, powers as well are a bit more complex to define, because, like in this case, the Burgundian States weren't considered, but as a sum of dynastic possessions of the House of Valois Burgundy. And each and every one constituted a polity on its own that had come to essentially accept, to recognize the Duke of Burgundy as their local ruler, so not as sort of subjects of the Duke of Burgundy, if not for the fact that your ruler was also the Duke of Burgundy back in Burgundy. It shouldn't be confusing if you know anything about the Middle Ages and their governmental practice. The Burgundian States have, as you know, a very sort of famous military history, especially in the later phase of the terribly inappealable destruction of the same Burgundian States during the wars with the Swiss Confederacy. There's a lot of talk about that. If anything, we'll see it better in the second episode, and I don't know when I'm going to do it, but it's surely underway with the material that I collected, if anything, from a visual standpoint for this one. There is a great talk regarding the fact that the Burgundian ordinances were, together with the Venetian condotta in the second half of the 15th century, the most advanced armies in Europe. With Burgundy, we get this sort of, we can say, reality check in the sense that, indeed, the army of Charles the Bold wasn't as strong as it looked. But in a more strategic sense, of course, we know that, first of all, nobody is invincible. There is nothing deterministic about who has to win or lose a war. However, it's also true that if you look at the various debacle of the Burgundian army, repeatedly against the Swiss that were also emerging with a very simple yet effective system that has nothing, say, sort of just tactically advanced as it was rather politically cohesive. I always have to explain these things, including, in the videos criticizing, at least commenting on the work of Schola Gladiatoria, because people are fixated with weapons winning wars and not sort of the broader moral dimension, properly the bigger strategic point of it all, and essentially its political point. But, from Clausewitz, it's too much to ask, of course, for the commoners. Nevertheless, we will cover in particular that part before. Today we start naturally from the end of the 14th century, so the birth of the Burgundian States, that are, in my opinion, also incredibly important from a military point of view, because they destroy, in fact, that notion, paradoxically, considering how the Burgundian States themselves ended, that late medieval infantry was per se, like starting from the 14th century in particular, progressively dismantling cavalry dominance on the battlefields, because the Burgundian armies of this period are the ones that literally destroy, without any exception, the only truly infantry-based armies of the 14th century. The Flemish ones, victors at Kortrijk, 1302, and barely at Mont-en-Pévèle, they are basically the only true victories that the Flemish ever achieved, and which victory, especially the first one, indeed, the second, again, so-so, but that get repeatedly destroyed by the Burgundians up to, in fact, feudal cavalry armies, so throughout the entire 14th and 15th century, until also the mediocre but still sort of politically satisfactory success of Guinegate, which is also fascinating because at that point you have the Habsburgs that have come into what remained of the Burgundian States, namely Flanders, while Burgundy proper had been taken over by the French. In fact, defeating the French, training partly, or attempting to train the local Flemish militia. We were talking Maximilian of Habsburg through Swiss instructors, because it's doubly paradoxical. You have this now Burgundians that defeat with Flemish armies cavalry force, not much in the sense that they destroyed the cavalry as infantry. It was a draw, basically, that saved at that point the Habsburgic Burgundian inheritance, and the Habsburgs that used, after the heavy defeats against the Swiss also in the early 14th century, before also their pike square sort of reform, and mostly through ambushes, in fact, nothing particularly clamorous in strictly open field terms. There were Swiss contractors that had used to train now the Flemish militia, and that reform, by the way, will fail, right? The Dutch military basic will not be a thing until the second half of the 17th century, as we've also recently documented. Not even the Dutch army of the 80 Years' War was this great match, right, in strictly military terms compared to the Spanish, regardless of the fact that they won. And again, already this picture probably is quite confusing for most of you, or at least those who come to know my channel for the first time. The point is also, in a more evidential political and historical sense, the affirmation of the powerful House of Burgundy through, in fact, this series of successful wars that went on for a very long time with great, in fact, results, with great achievement, that Charles the Bold at some point tried to sublimate through even the idea that he, negotiated with the same Maximilian, actually Frederick III, because Maximilian was young. He also met him on that occasion, and he would marry his daughter later, of creating literally a title of King of Burgundy within the Holy Roman Empire. So something very fairy tale-like, and it's I will surely make a biography of Charles the Bold, probably a political one, not a strictly military one. At some point we can do that to explain this better. But there is a veritable chivalric tradition. Think about the Order of the Golden Fleece that we recently also made a video on, so to say, considering what is written by Virgil regarding the Indo-European heaven and what the Argonauts story also with the Golden Fleece had historically meant. We will make, as you've seen also with the recent video about the Order of the Dragon, more videos about military orders, not just monastic military orders, that too, but in fact, especially in this period in history, something that sort of mirrors the oligarchization of knightly and nobiliar identity, that Burgundy in Europe became the veritable model symbol of at this point, the peak of chivalry, an incredibly rich court in between Western and Central Europe, France, and the Empire, that managed to quite strategically exploit the political division, the crisis of France during the 100 Years' War, the alliance with England, the internal sort of, in fact, Armagnac and Bourguignon, the Burgundian factional competition, the sort of fragmentation of especially Western Germany, and more. Naturally, there are also defeats. Notably, we will talk in the end, not in strictly chronological order, because it's sort of an extra compared to mostly the Low Countries theater that we will look at today, that is the famous Battle of Nicopolis, that was guided by the Burgundians, that were understood, if anything, at the time to be the top knights in Christendom, and so as such had an enormously high reputation, at least for that battle against the Ottomans, was also partially obfuscated. So it's difficult to make the stories because, of course, for every war, we would have to make a separated video, right? And this is the good practice that we make on Schwerpunkt. But since we have now this new biographical and strategy series that allow us to fill the gaps, in fact, the major gaps in our military historical telling, next to the arms organization, battles, tactics, military units, and sort of other thematic aspects of war anthropology, it's important to give a first flash of the wall, like realizing what this as a wall looks like, because otherwise, also methodologically speaking, people get lost in details and can't even rightly collocate those into the broader picture. At some point you have to give. Schwerpunkt has admittedly always been about this, the bigger but also the smaller picture at the same time, so you have this full breadth and depth of the picture. So the military history of the Burgundian states under the Valois dukes begins with the same, of course, establishment. Ideally, the Burgundian states. I made a video about the Duchy of Burgundy that explains how this dynastically, inheritance-wise, it came to happen. It could have even started earlier in time. There were really very strange biological sort of lucky charms, so to say, that prevented, or bad luck for that matter, charms that prevented this compaction from occurring. Also, from probably the mid 14th century, would have been clamorous, would have changed European history a big deal. And we can, of course, look at many different military actions with a historical microscope. For example, the Burgundians did not participate to the Battle of Agincourt, but the brothers of the Duke of Burgundy died in that battle, as a matter of fact. So we could at some point digress in these things, but we mostly deal with the biggest wars, the rebellions, battles that were properly fought by the Burgundian states, by the Dukes of Burgundy as such. And we can start with Philip the Bold's intervention in the Flemish rebellions, which were a bit of a leitmotif in the broader picture of the affirmation of Burgundian states, because basically you have this French state was incredibly advanced, incredibly consolidated, institutionally very centralized, very much jealous of its own prerogatives, could not be annexed by the French crown, even though they were still basically part of the royal family at the highest, properly, level of nobility in the Kingdom of France, that conquers a Flemish low country that will, in fact, gain some sort of cohesive proto-national compaction under the Burgundians themselves for the sake of administrative reasons. In fact, those are the only sort of Burgundian state that lives on as such, with that legacy, also with the Habsburgs. Think about St. Andrew's Cross brought to Spain through that mechanism from the Habsburgic Netherlands and so on. And the Flemish, again, are habituated to be autonomous. In many ways, they historically exploited the feebler feudal grip existing on the Low Countries that, up to the High Middle Ages, actually were a pretty primitive and undeveloped country, and that at this point instead had been flourishing, thanks also to this relatively decentralized position, becoming, as you know, essentially the richest country in Europe after the Italian city-states, and having enormous sort of political and strategic implications. Essentially, the control of the Netherlands was, in many ways, the casus belli for the 100 Years' War, or at least one of the most sort of important motivations behind the actually dynastic reason for which England and France won a war, again, for the French crown, right? And during the 14th century crisis, Flanders is actually able to, they are defeated by the French, but are somehow, probably by the French crown, they're somehow able during the initial phase of the 100 Years' War to slip away once again. Burgundy exploits this and takes over. In this big refeudalization of European warfare after the Black Death blow crisis. And so there's a brutal knightly and cavalry distraction of what were the only European armies fighting merely with infantry, the Flemish ones, because they were basically just third and fourth estaters without any cavalry. There had been some knights fighting among them, in a broader sense, but they had not constituted a fully fledged arm. Like even the Scots had lots of infantrymen historically and a few surplus for the elite, but they had some proper cavalry bodies. If you look at the Flemish armies, they didn't even have that. They tried to compensate with artillery because the same Burgundian army will actually surpass the French one, the French royal one, in terms of properly the establishment of the first true artillery park in Europe through the, however, relatively heterogeneous conglomeration of guns properly gathered from all these various Flemish towns. By the way, I made multiple videos about medieval Flanders, and especially the polities that constituted it. Many were also feudal, and the Duchy of Burgundy takes over those places as well, right? But it's mostly against the Flemish communes that the Valois Burgundy will fight. And this, in fact, wars proceed in a steady chronological arc through the reigns of John the Fearless, Philip the Good, and Charles the Bold. The Valois Dukes of Burgundy, as you know, were probably a cadet branch of the French royal family, ruling a composite state of French imperial territories at this point, and its big rival the same France in wealth and power. I personally believe that the Burgundian states were much more fragile than it's commonly believed. They're a bit too hyper-hyped for different reasons that are a bit sort of nationally, historiographically difficult to summarize. They also, the local sort of national historiography managed to sell itself well at the expense also of other parts of Europe. But if you realize how the Burgundian states crumbled, you realize that there was something there that is not really much debatable regarding the fundamentals of this, if anything, political stability, regardless of the military technicalities of the same. No doubt, again, the things could go differently, but I've had people even claiming on my channel, in the comments, that I also prohibited at that point that, oh my God, Burgundy would have conquered France. First of all, Burgundy was actually France, and if anything, they would have vied for some rise to the throne as opposed to a conquest. People think that these are paradox games with strange sort of national identities applied to the traditional dynastic rule of particular communities, as we've seen of dominions, and it's very difficult already to spend your time explaining this for countless times. It's probably a myth about Burgundy. I realize every fantasy novel that people for some strange reason want to write, when they sort of claimed to be self-styled, passionate about the Middle Ages, it has always to be about 15th century Burgundy, as if no other place or time existed in European history, including for Burgundy. Like, it's never like Burgundy in the 13th century, like literally the Dutch of Burgundy in the 13th century. No, it has always to be this quite specific angle and cut. In any case, each generation of the Valois Burgundy house added territories, subdued cities, and tested the limits of ducal ambition until the entire edifice collapsed in 1477 and was divided between France and the Habsburgs. Looking at the beginning, in 1382, the city of Ghent rose against the Count Louis II of Flanders, Louis de Mal, last of the Dampierre line that had been the historical counts of Flanders, and whose harsh fiscal policies alienated the powerful Flemish cities. The Dampierre had also, as noblemen, actually guided the aforementioned rebellion during the Franco-Flemish War, right? Even without cavalry. When you see these guys, for example, fighting with Henry VII of Luxembourg in Italy, they fought as cavalrymen, as knights, as crazy, right? When they fight at home in Flanders, that basically most of what they have is actual infantry, and they adapt accordingly, also because all those sort of early 14th century infantry battles, so to say, were always staged in a sense by knights that instructed the infantry how to behave and so on. The count had surrounded the walls, and when the citizens sued for terms, demanded that every man between 15 and 60 years of age present himself with a halter around his neck so that Louis might decide on the spot whom to pardon and whom to hang. Rather than submit, the men of Ghent chose to fight. instead. On May the 3rd, under the command of Philip van Artevelde, son of Jacob, the populist leader killed in 1345, Philip inherited his father's anti-comital stance, by the way. So there is this tension between the third estate and the second in this Flemish political dialectic that also documented in some political history videos, in particular about this sort of first half 14th century Flanders. So that the rebels burst from the gates and shattered Louis' overconfident army at the Battle of Beverhoutsveld. Louis fled at that point to his son-in-law, Philip the Bold, Philip II of Burgundy, youngest son of King John II of France, the guy who got captured at the Battle of Poitiers. All right, I made, as you know, a video about the masterpiece of the Black Prince. Philip II, who had, by the way, married Louis' daughter Margaret in 1369, the last of the Dampierre, because they were properly dowry heiresses to the, otherwise at that point, the extinguished male line of the house, and thus bringing Flanders, in a broader moral sense, into the Burgundian orbit at that point in history. That's a bit how the Burgundian states are established in a broader sense. Philip the Bold was at the time regent of France for the young Charles VI, the famously mad, because he became mad later, king whose minority allowed noble factions to dominate in a pretty dramatic moment in between also like the various phases of the 100 Years' War. Philip assembled a royal army south of Arras in the first days of November. We are in the northeast of Paris, heading essentially toward that was in Flanders and broader sense, and marching against the rebels. 6,500 men-at-arms, 2,000 pikemen, and 1,500 crossbowmen and archers, 10,000 soldiers in all. By the way, it's unrealistic to presume that they were actually 6,500 men-at-arms in that situation. They were much less, but we're talking still a typical French army of this time with essentially a few 1,000 men-at-arms in that situation at the most, also for the task. This sort of complement of infantry is pretty scarce after the Black Death crisis for broader sort of demographic manpower reasons. Philip himself paid for a fifth of the host and rode at its head beside the king, the Dukes of Bourbon, Louis II, head of a senior Valois line, and Berry, Jean notorious for extravagance and art patronage, and lords such as Olivier de Clisson, the Constable of France, a Breton warlord, Jean de Sancerre, and Enguerrand de Coucy, a great Anglo-French magnate holding lands in both realms. You understand how this was in many ways the crème de la crème of French power at that time. This would have been not necessarily a child's play, but the French were naturally confident to crush this Flemish Third Estaters. For the first time since Poitiers in 1356, the Oriflamme was unfurled on the occasion. I made a recent video about Montjoie Saint-Denis, and I'm going to make another one about the Oriflamme at some point. This was brought out of the Abbey of Saint-Denis as carrying with it properly the mountain of Jupiter, and so the symbol of the Sol Invictus and of sacred royalty, given that Saint-Denis itself was the mountain itself where the French monarchs were just slumbering before rising to power for the great clash of end time. So these actions were permeated with all the sort of moral and mystical load you can imagine. Again, by the way, this sort of, again, lower estates, upside down mentality, as during the 100 Years' War, as you know, also the Marchand de Law in Paris tried to get rid of the monarchy, of the nobility. In part, the Burgundians helped him in that, but France is a heavily aristocratic country, to say the least, and we will see what a difference this actually made on the battlefield as well. Against all the no infantry began to rise, starting to defeat cavalrymen from the later medieval century. Let's see what happens to these Flemish guys. A smaller supporting force under Louis II gathered at Rysel, The administrative capital, French Flanders. Consider that the county of Flanders, the Flanders as a historical country was part of the Kingdom of France with a county. A tiny bit was actually part of the Holy Roman Empire. I also made a video about the contemporary chronicler Jean Froissart, who incarnates the paradox of being the greatest French chronicler, historian of the era, although he was actually Flemish. And that recounts also a bit like that idea of France, Burgundy, the English in this specific time between the 14th and the 15th century as this almost ideal medieval knightly reality. Well, in many ways, this emerges literally from his work as a courtier, as a courtly historian. He worked both for France and England at different times. So it's an incredibly famous force for the 100 Years' War, together with others naturally, but in very much contextual to the very heartland where all these things were happening. Now, I intersperse these details because I know that you somehow like them to frame better the era and its meaning. Van Artevelde, so this Flemish head of the people, could put 30 to 40,000 urban levies into the field. Quite unlikely, were probably less, but still in the tens of thousands, which was in fact the fourth of a broader coalition also from other Flemish towns. This was the typical way the Flemish had gone at war since, can't say ever, because in the time of the peak of sort of feudalism in Flanders, of course, these were fully fledged armies with just knights, infantrymen like any other part of Europe. But with the collapse, in fact, of the feudal system, or at least of some of its sort of more original and equestrianly dominated, or properly, counting numerically, fashion was instead manifesting as a completely foot force, right? Which had, again, defeated the flower of the French cavalry, probably of European knighthood at Courtrai, which is not even just like you see in movies, the stupid French haughty noblemen that arrive and impale themselves on the. No, the French had actually even broken the Flemish phalanx by charging it across ditches and defenses, etc. It's just like a reserve, by the way, controlled by the Dampierre, that sort of tipped the balance there, and the battle was lost by the French. So it's never about, you're not more capable, intelligent, or more than a French knight of the early 14th century. And again, the notion that this infantry force was the future was miserably annihilated, as much as this, in fact, Flemish hosts. At this point, Van Artevelde's troops, at least the majority of them, were laying siege at Oudenaarde, a strategic textile center on the Scheldt River. Of course, we know that the Battle of Oudenaarde, make a series about Marlborough and Prince Eugene. At this point, medieval times, Flanders had some important names and specific battles, but mostly in feudal times, cavalry clashes. This was still a backdrop of Europe in many ways, and would become the sort of the protagonist with so many illustrious battlefields, mostly in the modern era. Van Artevelde left a skeleton garrison there, marched the main body west of Rysel to meet the French. The advance began on November the 12th at the river Liege near Common, the frontier between French and Imperial Flanders. We're pointing out before, 900 Flemings, commanded by Peter van den Bossche and Peter de Winter, held the only bridge which they had broken, by the way. Clisson ferried 400 knights across in the night. Men-at-arms had this commando capacities and roles also during sieges. They were the first on the walls, in the breaches, and so on. Rebuilt the span, right, of the bridge after a tense dawn skirmish and put the Flemish spearmen to flight. Also, by the way, for those who think that, again, you can't keep the knights away, just even on foot. So you can't imagine mounted. Van der Bosch escaped with a wound, but several towns at once paid heavy ransoms to King Charles VI. Van Artevelde took post on the Goodberg, a low hill between Oostnieuwkerke and Passendale, yet another famous name in the 20th century. The French encamped on the reverse slope. You see the typical array. Infantry does not advance in the Middle Ages to attack, right? You have to literally await the Swiss for doing so. So unless it's other infantry and or you're falling on the enemy flank, there is no disciplined enough infantry that can abandon defensive position to simply go attack cavalry at this point. So the Flemish, as they had done, as we've seen at Costreg, Montpevel, etc., they always picked this defensive position uphill. This was basically the standard for infantry at the time. On the morning of November the 27th, a thick fog cloaked the field. Van Artevelde moved first, forming his host into a dense square to blunt cavalry. The French sent forward an infantry wave to test the memory of the Golden Spurs in 1302, but the Flemings threw it back and advanced in their turn, which is connected also with the undisciplined third estaters here that not just do not have the capacity to advance without breaking, but are also in fact hot-tempered. They see this infantry breaking and they think that they can conquer the world. In the process, Clisson immediately struck the open flanks with heavy horse. Right, panic rippled through the Flemish rear. Men fled. The main body contracted into a ring at that point, and the ring was driven downhill and broken. Philip van Artevelde was killed in the press and his corpse set on a pike, as an example. This is typically normal also scenario in which cavalry basically cuts down infantry also in defensive position. Of course, the point was always moral in nature. It wasn't about the weapons. Were basically always the same: pikes in the front ranks, bludgeoning weapons in the rear for, say, cutting down the cavalrymen that would actually charge into the pikes and break through in some sections of the line, so that at some point they had to stop in the mass in between. And as we've seen, that we were saying before at Kortrijk, they were normally able even properly to pierce through the phalanx and breaking it. Here, there is no consistency. The French knights destroy this formation. By the way, remember that. We're talking ratios of 1 to 10, sort of, because we mentioned before a few thousand men-at-arms versus a few thousand commoners' infantry. The victory gave Philip the Bold no immediate profit. He inherited the county of Flanders only in January 1384 upon Louis' death, because as we've seen, he had married his daughter. And Gent's wealth was, in this sense, indispensable. A rebellion dragged on until the Peace of Tournai on December the 8th, 1385, because the rebels just had enough resources to entrench themselves in their own cities, and those were actually difficult at some point to take over, even after these bloodbaths, right? Normally, things would waver and fall, and this is exactly what happens in 1385. The French pressure Tournai, the old city of Clovis, from which everything had begun, so to say, to yield. Tournai was an episcopal city at the time, under French protection, serving also as a neutral ground. 26 years later, in 1408, the Prince-Bishopric of Liège furnished the next theatre of Burgundian arms. Liège was an ecclesiastical principality within the Holy Roman Empire, its own bishop elected by the chapter, but often imposed by external powers. John of Bavaria, also known as John the Pitiless, the youngest son of Albert I, the Count of Holland, Hainaut, Zeeland, had been installed as a prince-bishop in 1390, at the age of 17, with papal sanction, by the way. His authoritarian rule provoked repeated expulsions. In 1408, he fled to Maastricht, a condominium jointly ruled by Liège and Brabant, the Low Countries at this point in history are exactly the mess that they sound, and appealed to his brother William VI of Hainaut, I made a video about Hainaut, by the way, ruler of the counties immediately south of Holland, and to his brother-in-law John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Jean sans peur in French, who had assassinated, by the way, Louis of Orléans in 1407 and now dominated northern France. As a consequence, these are some of the most brutal pages of political violence in later medieval French history. We are not going to look at that, but just know that that's the the background and the quite cutely tender sort of spirit of the Dukes of Burgundy. With William II, Marquis of Namur, a small county wedged between Liège and Brabant, they raised a professional army. Henry of Horn, Lord of Pervais, a noble family tied to the anti-episcopal Avant clan in the Hesbaye Wars, if anything we can see that at some point as well, proclaimed himself Mambour and his son Prince Bishop, but the radical faction in Liège refused his proposal to abandon the city and waged guerrilla war from the countryside. On September the 23rd, the Liège militia occupied a gentle rise between the villages of Authe, Rutten, and Erstappe. John the Fearless drew up his men-at-arms dismounted in the center, flanked by 2,000 archers, and kept 400 mounted men-at-arms with 1,000 light horse in reserve. Very clever deployment. It looks very much like the English one of the 30 Years' War, except we tend to forget, everybody tended to really fight in this way. For example, having the archers on the side was really typical, especially in higher, later medieval Europe. What we see, if anything, is, as we've seen before also with the army against Gent, that there are few heavy infantrymen, right? The Flemish commoners can provide with lots of that because these cities remain somehow rich, but they're also contained within their own walls. They do not have states to rule on. Want these knightly sort of chivalric forces from the cream of French nobility. Reason like is mostly combined arms tactics, which with a infantry-only army like the Flemish one, that as we've seen does not even have a particularly integrated use of of missile forces, for example, does not really reason like, because they really lack the training. They're probably not inclined as third estators to do any of this. So given that the Flemish once again have deployed themselves in a defensive position on a slope, surprise, surprise, the Duke of Burgundy is obviously aware of the situation. Charging them head-on with cavalry is, an option, but if you have your men dismounted, maintaining cohesion, not sort of suffering too many losses against the enemy pikemen in first ranks, and you have this combined armed tactics to pepper the enemy lines, then attacking them at sort of different intervals, and you have these reserves ready to intervene and to sort of make the most of a combined armed tactic system, things can, and that only these professional forces can carry out, you have greater chances to win. All right. By the way, I'm going to make a video for each of these battles. Some of these are also relatively famous. This video is not for that. It's just for saying more or less what happened. And, of course, from primary sources, as we do for the tactical reconstruction series, much more can come on the surface. Interestingly enough, the Liégeois militia charged with spirit, but they were shredded by arrow storms, encircled and cut to pieces. So not a great performance, to say the least. This fact of also advancing themselves is somehow reckless, especially in front of such professional soldiery. Henry of Horn, his son, and most of the Liège nobility died on the field. As we've seen, there were noblemen also from this commoner side, but most of these troops are actual militias. John of Bavaria returned to the city at this point, hanged leading insurgents and their families, and earned the lasting surname, the Pitiless, for that reason. Burgundian influence now extended firmly over the Prince Bishopric of Liège as well. bit by bit. That's very patiently, very cleverly how the House of Burgundy created its own states. Then there are the Hook and Cod Wars. This also deserves another video. But these were fought essentially over the counties of Holland, Henegouwen, and Zeeland. Opening this next chapter, the Hook and Cod were the factions named after fishing emblems in these Flemish portual guilds. Hooks for the noble party, Cods for urban merchants. When Count William VI died childless in 1417, he was William II of Bavaria-Straubing, because of course the numeration depends on, again, who you are, which policy you are controlling, but also Count of Holland, Zeeland, Henegouwen, as we've seen. His younger brother John of Bavaria, the same Prince Bishop of Liege, and his only daughter Jacqueline, Jacoba van Beieren, countless in her own right, married successively to the Dauphin, Humphrey of Gloucester, and Frank van Borselen. If you wondered the Dauphin, why? Well, watch my video about Henry V. This is 2 years after Agincourt, and the English have at that point claimed quite something from the French crown. And both claimed the inheritance. However, the Cods backed John, and after his death in 1425, transferred their allegiance to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, who was called into question. The Hooks supported Jacqueline instead. Philip intervened decisively at Brovishaven on January the 13th, 1426. This is a Zeeland port crucial for English trade, by the way, and so very much involved in the struggle for the inheritance. Jacqueline had escaped Philip's custody in September 1425, reached Gouda, a Hook stronghold in Holland, and summoned help from her second husband Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, brother of Henry V, protector of England during Henry VI's minority, because at this point Henry V, as we've seen, had already died during one of his campaigns. An English force of 1,500 under Walter Fitzwalter, 7th Baron Fitzwalter, landed at Brovershaven to join 3,000 Zeelanders commanded by the Lord of Amstead, a powerful Zeeland noble family. Philip himself led 4,000 feudal retainers and municipal militias from Dordrecht, Den Haag, and Delft, including gunners and more than 1,000 crossbowmen. So nothing impressive. Again, gunners, crossbow are basically at this point also in history the same, right? Gunners are starting to appear as a relevant arm, a relevant section of missile forces on their own. But what counts is still heavy infantry as always. And especially as we've seen the Burgundian Knights here. Walter allowed the Burgundians to disembark unopposed. As the English advanced in good order, shouting and blowing trumpets, they met a cannonade and a storm of arbalest bolts. The longbowmen scattered the crossbowmen, which seems to have been, as you know, also during the 100 Years' War at large, a thing, even though we are very often quite unsure of how many from both sides and so on. But the Burgundian Knights closed in heavy plate and drove the English onto a dike. Almost the entire English contingent was thus destroyed. Thousands of Zeelanders fell, several local nobles were slain. Hampstead was taken prisoner, and Fitzwalter escaped by sea. This was a great victory for Philip. Jacqueline's cause collapsed as a consequence of this defeat. Humphrey, absorbed in English politics and enamored of Eleanor Cobham, his mistress, later accused of witchcraft, interestingly enough, obtained a papal annulment for his marriage in 1428. Jacqueline surrendered the administration of her countess to Philip, thus, who was named Heir. When she remarried without his consent in 1432 to Frank von Borsele, a Zeeland noble and stadtholder, the treaty was voided and the territories passed wholly to Burgundy as a consequence by feudal law. Philip the Good's long reign, 1419-1467, saw the Burgundian mosaic completed piece by piece. Philip purchased Namur in 1421 from John III of Dampierre, childless Marquis, inherited Brabant, that was, by the way, the most important of the Low Countries states, and Limburg in 1430 through his cousin Philip of St. Paul, last male of the Leuven line, and bought Luxembourg in 1443 from Elizabeth of Görlitz, Duchess in her own right. You understand how many clever, capable, sort of even lucky moves brought to the creation of the Burgundian States. In 1456, Philip sought to extend his grip to the Prince-Bishopric of Utrecht, a large ecclesiastical state covering the modern Netherlands, split between Nedersticht around Utrecht and Oversticht in the east, by appointing his illegitimate son David of Burgundy as bishop of the same city. The cities and nobility of the Oversticht refused to recognize a Burgundian prelate, though. So remember here, there is a strong opposition to essentially a French power. The Burgundians were French, and they were ruling over another country, another people, the Flemish. All right, there is all the Romance, Germanic drama involved in these frontier areas of still, big Belgium in particular, still bearing properly the legacy of the Walloon and Fleming rivalry. It's something beautiful to see also in the early modern age, ulteriorly intricated with the rise of sort of national versus imperial, Catholic versus Protestant. We really have some story to make here. Philip laid siege to the Hanseatic city of Deventer for 5 weeks until it capitulated and accepted David as both spiritual and temporal overlord. Hook resistance flared again in Utrecht, sparking 2 civil wars in 1470-1474, so this is something, if anything, we will see better in another video, in the later one about the Burgundian military history, the latter phase, 1481-83. Both ended, spoiler in any case, in Burgundian favor. This is the concept of it all, right? The Flemish here lost hopelessly everything, right? All the time. It's something incredible, really unique in medieval warfare. After a battle, especially of Westburg and the siege of Utrecht in 1483, we'll see them in the next episode. A final Hook revolt under Frans van Brederode, scion of an ancient Holland noble house, against Maximilian of Austria, Archduke, husband of Mary Burgundy, after Charles the Bold's death, was crushed in 1490. The greatest urban challenge of Philip's reign came from Gent between 1449 and 1453. The guilds had enjoyed a share of government since the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302. A council of 3 members, one chosen by the porters, one by the weavers, and one by the lesser crafts. These were, again, third estators guilds government of towns, essentially, not even united in some actual city-state institutional profile, maintained a delicate equilibrium, in fact, rather unstable one that could be exploited by the Burgundians. Philip sought to roll back these privileges to the situation before the Charter of Senlis in 1301. It was a French imposition after Bruges revolt, and to secure a steady revenue through indirect taxes. In January 1447, he proposed a salt gabelle on the French model. 2 years later, he added a tax on flour to be collected by ducal officials. That was quite imposing because, that's basically on bread. Ghent refused as a consequence. Philip removed the guild diacons from the council and recalled the bailiff. So a veritably feudal authority paralyzing the courts as a consequence. On October the 28th, 1451, the guilds proclaimed a general strike, seized arms, and established a revolutionary assembly of the people, those then fourth and third estators, that had literally destroyed, by the way, Flemish towns historically. Right at the beginning of the 14th century, the Flemish towns leagues could have evolved into something more consistent. That these socio-economical disruptions brought about by the same infight between these polities and this brutal radical populism, extremism, especially from the fourth estators. At least the third estators hoped to be co-opted by the nobility. destroyed literally the medieval Flemish civilization in many ways. Opponents were executed. In any case, only Ninove, a small textile town economically tied to Ghent, lent support that occasion. Philip declared war on March the 31st, 1452. The rebels occupied the castles of Puke, Schendelbeke, and Gavere, fortified manors controlling the Scheldt approaches, secured the bridge at Speere. We see how we recently made a video about the 1672 French invasion of the Netherlands that had their canals properly stripping lands from water since probably the expansion of the great medieval civilization under the feudal proper supervision. All right, so, really changing the landscape of these lands quite physically. And therefore influencing also local warfare. One of the reasons why the Flemish also fought with all this infantry, as we've seen also the French dismount at a point, is because these are all axes. It's a flat land, yeah, largely, but it's also not such an easy ground to begin with. So don't give for granted that cavalry was advantaged there. Philip also laid siege to Oudenarde on April the 14th with one of the largest artillery trains yet seen in Europe, partly already coming from these the subjects of Flanders. 16-ton bombard de la Grette, bombards, Vogler, and Serpentines, really massive firepower that was also better used against like thickly compact infantry formations at some point, but mostly used for siege warfare. Simon de Lalangue, a knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece, Philip's trusted captain, defended the city, burned the suburbs, organized fire watch parties and water tanks against incendiary shots, and answered every psychological ploy, false letters claiming betrayal, the parading of two boys alleged to be his sons with cannon fire. We'll talk also about Jacques de Lalangue. I have a video just prepared about him. Ghent failed to take Aalst or Gerardsbergen, key fortresses on the Dendre. On April the 24th, John II, Count of Nevers, Philip's cousin, head of a junior Burgundian line, seized Espierres and Helkin and joined Philip of Gerardsbergen. The besiegers on the west bank of the Scheldt fled, abandoning their guns and baggage. Those on the east bank were pursued on the gates of Ghent with more than 3,000 dead. From the 1st to the 15th of May, the Burgundians bombarded Ghent itself, so they finally got to that point, then withdrew, however, to winter garrisons at Aalst, Dendermonde, and Oudenarde. Skirmishing continued through spring. On June the 16th, 1452, 13,000 rebels from the Vaasland, the land of Vaas, a rural district north of Ghent under Wouter Landknecht, confronted 30,000 Burgundians at Bazen. They were likely all a bit less, at least the numbers are relatively... They're always a problem in medieval historiography, but not for the reasons that you're often told, right? It's just like sometimes we have a number, and from the others, it's mostly just like an estimate, and so maybe the historian, the modern historian writes for the sake of convention, okay, those guys were 30,000 because the source said that, but, you know, armies of 30,000 men at this point were not that frequent, especially in places like the Low Countries, at least, especially of the nature the Burgundians could field. Yeah, they were more compact. It's not like they weren't big, but they were, in fact, for this reason, more qualitative than quantitative. Philip lured the rebels from their defenses into open field, routed them, and in revenge for the death of his favorite bastard son of Corneille of Burgundy, killed earlier in the campaign, laid the whole region waste. By the way, you see here that these Flemish are, in a sense, overconfident. They should have known better. They were just commoners. They hadn't much going on from a military qualitative point of view. Why would you even expose yourself? Naturally, this is more like strategy than tactics, but still, as we've seen before, also there was this hot-headedness that didn't really help. It's a way also for the untrained to vent, because you are incredibly excited, anxious, and that's what unfortunately happens with the untrained to get themselves killed as that. 800 to 1,000 Luxembourgers ordered to the field, by the way, arrived only after the fighting was over. A deliberate tardiness repeated every year, by the way. These Luxembourgers didn't really fancy go fight, for the Dukes of Burgundy out there. A 6-week truce mediated by Charles VII of France, Philip's Valois cousin, eager to weaken Burgundy, allowed Gent to plunder the countryside unmolested through the winter. At the same time, Philip thus resumed the offensive on June the 18th, 1453. Schwerpunkt fell after 2 days of bombardment. 104 prisoners were hanged. Puka was reduced to rubble between the 2nd and the 5th of July, though the knight of the Golden Fleece, Jacques de la Langue, famous tournament champion brother of Simon, was killed by a cannonball, an omen for the times, for the future in a sense, like not necessarily because the Burgundians had the better guns, and in spite of that they wouldn't be able to win against the at the time poor Swiss that literally didn't have properly the resources to have artillery. They had to steal them from the Burgundians. But 1453 is the end of the 100 Years' War, which is very much something felt in this region, especially by the Burgundians, but also the year of the fall of Constantinople. So times are really changing, and a knight killed by a cannonball is something that will echo in other examples. Think about the Chevalier Bayard or Giovanni dalle Bandiere. These are all big names connected to this quite now more oddly and dramatically frequent death among the knightly ranks. Right, artillery still didn't make the game, but was there, and somehow the indicator is something else that had been changed. The last outpost, Gabert, was bombarded from July the 18th. On July the 23rd, the English mercenary captain John Fox and his men slipped out wearing Burgundian crosses and reached Ghent at dawn. The power of arms, by the way, at this point. In the ensuing panic, 25,000 citizens were coerced into a relief column. Philip had concealed the bulk of his army in the wooded valley of the Liege. An artillery exchange opened the battle. A spark ignited a Ghent power barrel. The gunners fled in panic spread. Burgundian charges cut the militia to pieces. Right, a plot that we have too often seen already. This is like, if you really want to show anyone claiming that infantry was making it right at this point in history against cavalry, please mention, you can mention this video of course, but mention specifically the Valois Burgundy Flemish wars, because that's, just the same thing. You have to appreciate, by the way, the Flemish stubbornness there, which is still a quality of some sort, because in any case, you still keep seeing Flemish rebels spawning here and there. 16 to 20,000 of them, by the way, fell, which for these single communities at the time, the 15th century, is really a lot, right, demographically speaking. Only 1,000 held long enough for Charles the Bold, Philip's son and heir, already a seasoned commander, to rescue his father from the melee. However, so they were also combative, and there is no doubt that you can sort of suck as an army with being incredibly combative. For some reason, mostly smearing nationalities online, usually the last 20 years, people believe that you win wars if you are courageous or not. No, right? If anything, one of the few useful, maybe the only useful thing about reenactment is that demonstrating that every idiot everywhere can get himself killed. All right, that courage can be considered, as von Clausewitz says, also the noblest of virtues in that sense. But as he also explained, is actually quite cheap in the bigger picture. All right, there is really not in history an army that, for the same fact of getting there on the field and fighting, was, and even in the case in which it was exterminated, was was not courageous enough to get exterminated to be there in the first place. These things do not work, right? Humans are very easily co-opted into actual combat. They get themselves killed very easily. That's actually one of the basics, and the entire warfare shows it without any exception. Now, in any case, this was the moment in which Gent surrendered. So it surrendered at once after this debacle. It's very important because Gent is the most important city at this point, a bit like the heart of this rebellious feeling across land. The Peace of Gavere abolished the Revolutionary Assembly, curtailed guild power, required the demolition of the city's fortifications, quite wisely, and confirmed the Duke's right to indirect taxation. The Valois-Burgundy lordship was extended on Ghent. This last campaign also demonstrated the increasingly important role of gunpowder artillery. Again, I'm preparing this video about Jacques de Lalaing because he was not much because how he died, but mostly because he died as one of the greatest knights and tournaments fighters and winners ever in this highly, again, chivalric and knightly world of, he fought in Britain and on the continent. He was really very international and famous, and also to die like that is something. While Philip the Good tamed the cities of the Low Countries, the last great crusading venture of the Middle Ages ended in catastrophe at Nicopolis. We are on September 25th, bit back in time, 1396. I let this as the last, or almost, actually, of these clashes for the end, because it deserves a particular attention. We never really talk about the Balkan Crusades, something, of course, about the local sort of clash against the Turks, but never quite about Nicopolis, Varna in particular. Now, Pope Boniface IX, Roman Pope during the Great Schism, had proclaimed the Crusade in 1394, though the Western Schism had long since robbed papal cults of their former authority, at least up to that point. He made a video about the Age of Councils, so it's exactly the ones that followed also because of this general crisis. One about 15th century Roman papal power, how it was restored at the beginning of the 15th century, and so how important it would be also for the later campaigns against the Turks, think about Belgrade 1446 and so on. In any case, at this point, we're, by the way, in the first real sort of attack against the Ottomans, in a sense. There had been the Crusade of Smyrna back in the day, but we are even before the mid-14th century crisis, so we're going too backwards, like crabs, for this to be relevant. In any case, the truce in the 100 Years' War and the prestige of Philip the Bold combined to make this Burgundian leadership feasible for the crusade. Philip extracted 120,000 livres, pounds, from Flanders and planned to lead the host himself with the Dukes of Orléans, Louis, brother of Charles VI, and Lancaster, John of Gaunt, uncle of Richard II. None of the three ultimately sailed, however. Instead, he placed his 24-year-old son, John, the Count of Nevers, the future John the Fearless, in nominal command, and prevailed upon the veteran Enguerrand de Coucy to serve as chief counselor. King Sigismund of Hungary, also Holy Roman Emperor-elect, fighting to preserve his kingdom. We've seen how the aforementioned Order of the Dragon was established after the Nicopolis debacle in Hungary. The order in Hungary, sent 4 knights and a bishop to Paris, painting a lurid picture of 40,000 Turks ravaging Christendom, by the way. The French nobility responded with enthusiasm. This was still a time in which really, and also against all who think that somehow the West let the Byzantines simply die, which to an extent is true, but to the other, it's not like they didn't try or they didn't have at some point the opportunity to destroy the Turks so easily that at that point nobody really even thought that the Ottomans would have become the great threat they would have been. The Venice and the Hospitaliers, for example, after the Battle of Ankara, could simply unplug the Ottoman lifeline. Instead, they decided, also with some sort of valid calculation at the time, because you can't predict the future, in 4 months what is factually going to happen. They needed the Ottomans there, as opposed to Timur the Lame, and well, that's another story for another video. But the French responded with enormous spirit, as it had historically been, by the way, the case for the Outremer ventures, in fact, called like this also because they were fundamentally dominated by the French. There had been, as we were saying before, other expeditions. I have a pretty hefty playlist about Crusades warfare, so if you're interested, there's plenty of that. So we have 5,000 knights and squires, 6,000 archers and foot soldiers drawn from the best volunteer mercenary companies. Again, how many arrived to Nicopolis, and also with the documentation at the time, is something debatable. We will see it shortly in the video about the tactical reconstruction of Nicopolis. Things were always balancedly odd than they sound. You see, oh my God, all these men at arms, and then how many actually arrived there, how was the thing actually led, and why eventually also the crusade failed, and so on. That's all something that requires its fair share of explanation. Today we will only partially recount the whole picture. The Knights Hospitalier came from Rhodes. Venice supplied the fleet, and contingents arrived from Hungary, Wallachia, Transylvania, and the German lands. Modern estimates place the Christian total between 7,500 and 17,000. So the whole army, which is not even that big, telling the truth. The Ottomans under Sultan Bayezid I, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, conqueror of Bulgaria and Serbia, numbered 12 to 20,000, including 1,500 Serbian heavy cavalry, led by Prince Stefan Lazarevic, despot of Serbia, Bayezid's vassal after Kosovo-Polje. I recently made a video about the late medieval Serbian army organization, and you have to painfully realize that, in fact, the Serbians were subjected to the Ottomans before some sort of short time coming back. These are fair estimates without the bigger, exaggeration. The Crusaders left Dijon, so the heart of the Duchy of Burgundy, a hell of a capital, the city of mustard and wine. And on April the 30th, 1396, descended the Danube to Buda, the capital of Hungary, and planned to expel the Turks from the Balkans, relieve Constantinople, cross the Hellespont, and march through Anatolia to liberate Jerusalem. That was the horizon. Then we know that it was cut short, but you want to appreciate that this was actually feasible. Venetian ships blockaded the Sea of Marmara on the occasion. The land army pillaged so-called schismatic territories, which were largely Orthodox, and massacred the garrison of Rahova, a Danube fortress. They reached the fortress of Nicopolis on September the 12th. This was a key Bulgarian stronghold on the lower Danube. Perched on a limestone cliff above the river, the stronghold was well supplied and confident that Bayezid would relieve it. The Crusaders had both no siege engines. By the way, Marshal Boucicaut, Jean II Le Mangre, future constable of France, one of the greatest of knights of the era, and again, a hell of a figure. We surely... Actually, I'm going to put it here because, for the suggestions, because it's one of those that you really want to... I have also a little model, Marshal Boucicaut, since I was little, declared that ladders in courageous hands were worth more than catapults. Naturally, at the end of the 14th century, gunpowder artillery was already a thing, but you have to admit that in the Balkans, after all, I've seen it recently, but the availability of artillery was still relatively meager, right? You really need the Ottomans to conquer Constantinople for having a dignified artillery park, and surely a fearsome one for themselves. But in general, everything seemed much more flying, right? We talked about medieval warfare many times, and here, of course, there is a comparison between a Western and an Eastern, so to say, military system. The Crusaders settled into a leisurely blockade, feasting and insulting Turkish valor. Of course, considering how things ended, probably the stories were added to say, oh, look, that's the reason why they were so cocky, overconfident, whatever. Bayezid forced marched through the Shipka Pass and appeared sooner than expected. The Turks would have, by the way, been surely insulting the Crusaders in the same way. Sigismund proposed that the Wallachians under the voivode Mircea the Elder absorb the lightly armed Ottoman vanguard. The French then charged the main body, and the Hungarians and allies sweep the flanks. This was actually a good plan. The young French lords, led by the Constable Philippe Dom, a senior loyal officer, insisted, however, on the honor of the vanguard and denounced any delay as cowardice. This is also one of the reasons why, again, it's believed that the battle was lost. On the morning of September the 25th, the French vanguard crushed the conscript screen and pursued uphill in disorder. That wasn't, perhaps, in fact, the optimal way to go, but we also have, here really, if you don't read the primary sources, it's a bit difficult to appreciate what would actually happen. At the crest, the Crusaders met Bayezid's reserve Sipais, the elite Ottoman cavalry, feudal knights essentially on their own regard. I also made a video about them for the early modern age. Trumpets, kettle drums, and the cry of God is great announced to counterattack. From Islamic side, the French broke. Admiral Jean de Vienne, the carrier of the Oriflamme that had been brought from Saint-Denis, fell, rallying the standard. John of Navarre was unhorsed and captured. The Allied contingent was enveloped. Sigismund escaped down the Danube, famously to Venetian ships. Bayezid toured the field hoping to find the King of Hungary's corpse. Discovering the Rahova prisoners already slaughtered, he ordered a general massacre the next day. This was really carried out also for intimidating, probably to affirm their own rule over this high nobility of Europe captured. 7,000 were bound in groups of 3 or 4 and beheaded or dismembered before the noble captives. Only those under 20 awarded heavy ransom were spared. I mean, this is very psychological, and you can imagine the trauma of going through this, but these were also knights. In their own regard, were raised with an enormous sense of themselves and incredible metaphysical clarity. They understood that everything sort of weighed on them, at least on the leader. And in a sense, they would have not been touched. These were people habituated to kill hundreds of people with their own hands. So seeing even their own men massacred in front of them by the Turks was something they could expect. A ransom of 200,000 gold florins secured the release of Navarre and the surviving lords in 1398. This was really a disaster. The defeat ended the Second Bulgarian Empire. By the way, I also made a video about that. Tightened Ottoman control of the Balkans and discouraged further European coalitions for half a century. You can see all the motives here for something wrong that, however, are not connected with any specific Eastern superiority whatsoever. It's just the Westerners that screwed up. It happens. At some point, others screw up too. If anything, also the plan to use the Wallachians seemed sort of more sensible because of how the Ottomans normally fought. But you could never tell, really. Nor we can't necessarily criticize how this was actually carried out because, again, these were among the most competent men at the time of warfare. We can't really understand today how to do better than what they thought. You can listen to others, but not necessarily know yourself in an accurate and objective sense. Bad decisions are always bad decisions, but remember that the Ottomans did not have the strength to contain the Western center. So that they had to recur to more complex enveloping maneuvers that, were essentially relying on basically the hope that their own center would hold so long for at least the enveloping maneuver to be carried out, and hopefully at that point would have still been an iron arm. We've seen in the Battle of Pelagonia how that's from the 13th century in the Balkans there were successful combinations of heavier and lighter forces. Historically, the same Ottomans had done that. So the Battle of Nicopolis is quite fascinating for the sort of cultural clash in many ways, but at the same time, there is some broader strategic principle at the root of that. The Ottomans managed to correctly outline that the Westerns may have in fact been involved by, but more by leadership, by some kind of general mistake, misassessment, whatever, rather than any particular sort of debacle. Also because at the end of the day, if you lose, you lose. Even if you fought well, it's what we were saying before about the French at the Battle of Courtrai, right? That was a terrible defeat, but it's not like they hadn't come that close to actually succeed. All right, and so you may want to be a bit more humble in the evaluation. We will talk briefly here about Charles the Bold because we arrived basically at the end of the 60s, and he was already around, by the way. He succeeded his father in 1467 and pursued a policy of unrelenting expansion. The Prince-Bishopric of Liege, already restive under the Burgundian imposed Louis de Bourbon, seen a nephew Philip the Good installed as bishop in 1456, erupted in a series of 3 wars between 1468 and 1468, with which we stop today's video. In the first, Res van Eyers, a populist leader from the Esbjerg, you always see the same dynamic here, deposed Bourbon and ravaged the lands of Overmaas, the imperial enclaves around Maastricht. Charles, fresh from the War of the Public Weal, I made a video about this last spring. This was a league of princes against Louis XI's centralization here, basically after the 100 Years' War. France was recompacting everything. That's also why, as I was saying in the beginning of the video, what could Burgundy practically do? Probably something, but not in the sense that it was a power at this point capable of sort of tackling the French one, nor a clash would have followed that sort of national pattern, because also Burgundy wasn't a nation as we intended. Well, Charles the Bold routed a Liege militia of 2,000 to 3,000 with 1,800 cavalry at Montenacan on October the 20th, 1465. Again, the same old picture. French cavalry destroying Flemish infantry. 3 charges overcame defensive artillery, which had been defended with sort of portable stakes, all this kind of stuff. The 100 Years' War has left some mark, as we've seen before. There are longbows, there are this practice of dismounted knights. But as we've seen, this is not universal, and this is also, in fact, what we should understand about the 100 Years' War tactics as well. I made a series about this topic last spring as well. 1,200 Liégeois fell as the consequence of this defeat. The Peace of Saint-Truiden, a town in the county of Laon, stripped the principality of its liberties and reinstated Bourbon. When Philip the Good died in June 1467, Liège rose again, expelled Bourbon, and looked to Louis XI of France for aid, by the way. Charles sacked Dinant, a copper-working city on the Meuse, in August, casting 800 citizens into the Meuse as well. At Brustem, on October the 28th, 12,000 civilians, we really mean it as commoners, because these were normally people who hadn't picked up any weapon up to the day before. That's what these Flemish militias are basically about. In 500 horse under Res van Eyers, his wife Pentecote d'Arkel and Jean de Wilde faced 25,000 professionals. The Liège vanguard repelled the Burgundian first line, but the second line, armed with 2-handed swords, turned the counterattack into a rout. This is very interesting. Chopping people to pieces on foot, because 200 swords are used, of course, only on foot. This is probably the prerogative of the sold. Knights, heavily armored, at this point the peak of armoredness in the history of the art of war, cutting to pieces weight of all this more lightly armed Flemish infantrymen. 4,000 died. Darkness alone saved the remnant of the rebels. What happened in this battle? Once again, it's all the same. When I tell you something, it is the case. Liège surrendered on November the 12th and became a Burgundian protectorate under Guy de Ambercourt, a Picard noble and Golden Fleece knight. The cities of the county of Laon, a secular county next to Liège, were compelled to demolish their walls. The Third War began in October 1468 when 240 rebels retook the city and massacred the Burgundian garrison at Tongeren, ancient Tong, a lone town. Charles marched with Louis XI at his side at this point. The two kings, in fact, briefly allied against the Liegeois, because the French, in any case, were culminated by the hatred towards this Flemish Fortress State rebels, and a good bloodbath every once in a while is objectively funny. 500 Liegeois who tried to bar the way at Lantin were driven into the village church and burned alive. You have the barbecue here as well. Vincent de Beuren organized hit-and-run sorties from the walls. On the night of the 29th to the 30th of October, 600 volunteers, the Franchimontois, named after the castle of Franchimont, symbol of Liège resistance, slipped out to assassinate the Duke and the King. The attempt failed, and every man was killed. Liège capitulated the next day. As you understand, they were really run out of realistic ideas. Hundreds were bound and thrown into the moat. The city was given to the flames and burned. Here also the French were run out of fantasy, right? It was set for 7 weeks, by the way. This went on. Burgundian rule over Liège ended only with Charles' death in Nancy in 1477 against René of Lorraine and the Swiss. It's one of those, indeed, battles that marked an era. So here the spoiler for next time. This is incredibly famous in general. Charles' daughter Mary considered the great privilege, a charter restoring urban liberties across the Netherlands, and Liège regained its autonomy. The War of the Public Weal in 1465 had been the opening act of Charles' reign. Alarmed by Louis XI's centralizing reforms, Charles allied with the Dukes of Brittany, Francis II, the Bourbon John II, and Lorraine John II, and with the Armagnac lords as well, led by John V of Armagnac, to restore feudal prerogatives and carve out an independent Middle Kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Jura Mountains. Again, we've seen the word of public weal already from a political standpoint in another video. This was happening in parallel with the aforementioned rebellions. So it's interesting, in a world sense, and considering how the Burgundians were still to be tamed by the French, that, however, won in a broader sense. Hence, admittedly, Louis XI did not invade Burgundy at any point, but simply had the opportunity of witnessing it destroying itself against the Swiss, and at that point to invade the duchy, seizing it for good, and so that you have in the Low Countries the rest of Mary of Burgundy. Because in theory, there could be a French royal marriage, but like what had happened would happen later with Brittany in the Renaissance. But Louis XI probably did the right thing, sort of seizing one wall element, probably the duchy, that belonged also in a sense to the kingdom and to begin with. And then if you think about this, the fact that the Low Countries went to the Habsburgs historically also opened to a spiral of wars throughout history. So one could never really say how things would have actually gone, but surely this wall could not in the moment be taken over entirely by the French, that however seized an enormous amount of territory also in the north. Louis, supported by Gaston IV of Foix, Count of a Pyrenean principality, and great cities that sided with the monarchy, in fact raced to secure Paris, as the rebels from all these various directions were coming to, in fact, make a coup fundamentally. At Montlhéry, famous battle on July the 16th, 15,000 royal troops, mostly cavalry, met 20,000 of the League with strong artillery. The battle dissolved into a chaos of individual duels and partial engagements. Pierre de Brezé, a Norman grandee and royal favorite, broke through on the right and fell. His enraged men annihilated their immediate opponents. In the center, Louis was unhorsed amid confusion. His uncle, the Count of Maine, Charles IV of Anjou, fled with a third of the army. The League held the field at dusk, but Louis slipped away in the night and entered Paris with his banners flying. So in a sense, this was a draw, regardless of the mess. By the way, what is really typical of 15th century warfare, we explained it many times, is that the formations turned out to be linear, like what had been in depth in the previous centuries largely at this point is deployed in width, right? 3 divisions instead of probably the 3 battles in depth. And this was similar to how, I don't know, in the 12th century that they fought. Also, Bouvines had actually been fought in that way, but eventually from the 13th century onwards, everything was in depth because of the increased power of cavalry. At this point, armies were normally smaller, also for different matters of command control, things were a bit more complicated. Anything. Also, part of cavalry force was reduced at this point, after all. The Battle of Montclair deserves a video on its own. It's very picturesque, as you have understood. Now, the Breton and Burgundian armies joined on July the 19th and laid siege to the same Paris. Treaties followed in quick succession. Conflans on October the 5th, which gave Normandy to Charles of France, Louis' younger brother, styled Charles of Normandy, and the Somme towns to Charles the Bold. Saint-Maur on October the 29th and Caen on December the 23rd distributed instead further territories and offices. A committee of 36 under Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, hero of the 100 Years' War, was to reform the governmental abuses. Louis observed none of the terms for long, however. He punished the lesser rebels, revoked the concessions, and absorbed the Duchy of Burgundy itself after Charles' death and Nancy in 1477. In any case, that the solidity of the French state prevailed over all this, and with Louis XI, there was also the guerre fou later on, before the rise of Charles VIII, but let's say in practice, the most dangerous had been the Praguerie under Charles VII, but the War of the Public Veil basically showed the solidity of the Valois system, the great ability of Louis XI. Louis XI was one of the greatest kings of France, arguably the best of the 15th century, and he definitely knew his deal in a broader political sense. There was a bit of a dark legend sewn on him, but he was really a very capable and smart ruler. So we will see, of course, how things ended from a military point of view for the Burgundians. It was interesting to see a bit their perspective in all this with the Flemish, with the French. So we realized that the military trajectory of the Burgundian Valois ran from the suppression of Flemish rebellion under Philip the Bold in 1382 through the civic conquest and crusading disaster of Philip the Good to the over-ambitious wars of Charles the Bold, ending in 1477 with the partition of the inheritance between France and the Habsburgs through Mary's marriage to Maximilian. The dukes left behind a legacy of professional forces, very advanced artillery, centralized administration, the memory of a fleeting lowland empire that had briefly rivaled the kingdoms on either side. Yes, it's all true, but it should be more realistically framed sometimes. This is interesting because we used to make it. It was just the lottery extraction, the cycle that provided us with that by probably the extraction. More videos about Burgundy. I have here all together summing the old Burgundians, the Kingdom of Arles/Burgundy, the Duchy of Burgundy, the Burgundian States. Here the 20th video made on them. On the states, here I see this is just the 9th. It's not even too few, really. It's mostly political history, but some of the first videos were all within basically the first year of Schwerpunkt. Some were also re-uploaded. They were about the Burgundian army of Charles the Bold. They had Burgundian flags, the medieval formations of probably the sort of the orders of Charles the Bold before the battle, even though they were sort of divertissement, they fought in different ways. The same Burgundian army organization between 1467 and 1477, so that's the period we will see later. The Burgundian army dress, so there is actually lots still to do, and in the last months I really went hard with specials, and also this video in fact is part of that. But you understand, so it diluted a little bit the lottery, and there is I don't know, military historical units about the Burgundian army were never really done, aside from some generic stuff. I don't know, the crossbow, the pavise of the 1480s or something like that. But also a video like this, I think, makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, it really shows you how things went eventually, and with a overview of also what kind of military power could be employed, how methodic the Dukes of Burgundy. If anything, we will make some probably military biography of the same altogether, because it's the only way also to see a bit more in depth the complexity of all these wars, the rebellions. They weren't, as you understood, like regardless of the continuous Burgundian victories over the Flemish, anything sort of easy per se, right? Everything was normally complicated and dangerous. You've seen how deadly these clashes could be. Then everything gets also a bit mixed with French politics, because otherwise you can't really understand that. Again, the Burgundians, if you think about that, stayed fairly away from the carnage that the 100 Years' War really was. I mean, politically, they did very heavy stuff, including, kidnapping Joan of Arc and all this stuff. But they really undermined the French the French crown's power as well. So they had a very sort of despicable role at the end of the day from that perspective. France won anyway, but they were French themselves, and that's also what made it worse, arguably. But they also didn't involve themselves too much, directly at least, into the greatest clashes of the 100 Years' War. Also exactly because by pulling out of that, they favored the English indirectly, because they should have been serving the crown. At the same time, there's a lot of valid opportunism, meaning that building this territory across France and the Empire is really unique. It is probably, again, overrated because it was something very contingental. As you understand, there is not even a specific strategy. This is not like, I don't know, the same England and France fighting against one another, a broader struggle that everybody waged well the wars that were fought, as you understand here. But everything was much more seizing all these opportunities in a highly fragmented low country theater rather than having any bigger goal, right? In fact, when Charles the Bold turned against the Swiss, he lost literally everything, and including his life and the unity of this Burgundian state. So I think they are partly overrated. I think there is something to it that is incredibly fascinating because of also the aesthetics, the wealth, the chivalric ideals, and so on. And surely this were the capital property of European tournament, of this idea of knightly ethos and etiquette as well. At the same time, they also probably juggled too much at a time, and probably they things could have gone differently. Like, hadn't the wars with the Swiss, for example, I made some videos also about here. I don't remember if a comparison between the Swiss and the Burgundians, and we didn't make too much about the Swiss either, but there too you may simply wonder, could things really go differently? Well, kind of, right? About the Swiss, really only 6 videos. We really need to do more, right? And I like this era, the 15th century. I felt like for years they were a bit neglected on the channel, but now we have over 100 videos on it, so everything is starting to gain form in a denser fashion. It's mostly warfare, admittedly, because still also historically we didn't make as much as I would have liked personally, but overall, of course, also warfare shows you the way for that matter. So I'm not particularly troubled. We have covered really an impressive amount of stuff. And the more we go on, the more interconnected this whole thing is, which is the ultimate plan. I'm glad that you appreciate my work, the general distribution here of content. I understand that you're calamitated, probably like magnets towards the Indo-European religious stuff. But there is also this stuff, which very often people do not really realize being relevant and important. I don't know how it's all perceived as a whole, but I can say my strongest points are necessarily warfare, but at least I'm an expert in this stuff. And so if you have any specific interest in in an objective answer, some of you for example told me about those videos about scholarly disorder that you appreciated the fact that I was explaining how they actually fought at the time in a broader sense, and so framing also weaponry in an accurate fashion, not just in an individualistic or materialistic sense. And that comforted me, because that's exactly what I'm looking for. If I have to make video commentaries of other channels work, like it's sort of way of doing it, of getting views. That's how I also made it recently. But at the same time, reflect that what I know and what I do is at the same time basically this, like the general the general notions that I discuss there are also the ones that I built in part, not just through my work, but through the same videos here. I mean, my work as a historian outside of here. So it's a matter of support, as always. Like, if we do this together, we can reach very far places. If we don't do anything, it doesn't happen. I have an avalanche of videos incoming, and I'm sure that you will appreciate them. But let's accelerate, because this is really worth it. And that's how far we can go much more far away. There is much more that we can really achieve here, and it's impossible to unsee it in many ways, in potential, but also in act. We are rising. We are increasing. Again, there's been a moment of very interesting change also in the algorithm in other ways, but here we're getting somewhere we should be, and the best is yet to come for all what we have already done. We're never going to run out. I'm going to die before I exhaust all the things I want to say, and this is very comforting, as a matter of fact, because I definitely know what to do with the rest of my life. But and it's strange, because YouTube, like most of the people say, at some point I don't want to do this anymore, because it's more like a hobby, right? It's just like, I don't know, getting that video with hundreds of thousands of views, and then stay away from that, having some existential crisis where I'm absolutely wired in an opposite way. Or at least I understand that, of course, like, you can't do YouTube forever in theory, but if the thing keeps going, and this is actually greatly helping me in my work and reaching out, and I earn even out of it, next to fortunately what I have on through other incomes and so on. It's cool, right? And I see a reason, a purpose, and this seems all very, very generally good, positive as a thing. So I'm really thinking about this, and I think that we can absolutely go on without any particular issue. So this was just the first part, by the way, as I was pointing out. We will see the rest of Burgundian military history later, because it's a bit more complicated, right? And even if we haven't made the battles that are extracted via the lottery, we can make at least the times and meaning series type of videos, which is partially also tactical analysis, but mostly talking about the very important of the battle. We made it at this point recently for Granada, for example. Or in general, this sort of overviews of this case, the major wars and of course battles as well are useful. They tell you essentially where to make soon. Say you can remember the same battles that we observed here. You know what we're talking about. It's not like something falling from the sky. You can't contextualize it in bird pictures. I think it's very useful, and that's why I love this type of video making for myself, because I'm learning myself this stuff along the way. On top, of course, of things that after 2,600 videos, something you will have memorized. Plus, if you work as a historian from decades at this point, like it's going to help both ways. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.